Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Daniel Watkins, and on today's episode of the podcast, we'll be going back to the middle of the 19th century, one of the most important periods in Alnwick Castle's history. This was the time that Algernon Percy, the 4th Duke of Northumberland, undertook a huge restoration of the castle, transforming it both inside and out from the Gothic castle that his grandparents, the 1st Duke and Duchess, had created a century earlier. While the castle's interiors were now designed to look like an Italian Renaissance palace, the exterior was remodelled too, with a new covered entrance to the staterooms, and the additions of the Prudhoe Tower, which today houses the library, a servants' corridor, now the China Gallery, and the Great Kitchen, among other spaces. The architect responsible for this work was Anthony Salvin, and to find out more about him and his life, what he did at the castle, and to share some of the latest research and discoveries as part of the Great Kitchen project here at Alnwick, we spoke to castle and architecture expert John Goodall. Here's our conversation with John. Please enjoy. We're very happy to be joined once again on the Alnwick Castle podcast by architectural editor for Country Life and author of various excellent books about castles, John Goodall. Good morning, John. How are you?
Good morning, Daniel. It's really nice to be back. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're speaking today because you recently visited Alnwick Castle again, and we're looking at it not as the medieval fortress, but as a 19th century restoration of a castle, mainly by the architect Anthony Salvin.
Yes, I'm ashamed to say I had never been to the kitchens that he built before, and I was absolutely blown away by them. I mean, they haven't really been publicly accessible before, in fairness, but visiting them with you was an extraordinary experience, so grand and completely in keeping with the scale of Salvin's work elsewhere through the castle.
We'll get on to the kitchens in a little bit because they are architecturally really impressive. We should maybe start first of all by asking, who was Anthony Salvin?
Yeah, Anthony Salvin is a really interesting and unusual figure in the 19th century. He's one of the fathers of what we call the Gothic revival, this fascination with reviving Gothic architecture in Britain and medieval architecture in Britain. But unlike nearly all his peers in this period, he actually comes from quite a wealthy background. He is a relatively wealthy figure, and his interest is fired, I think, quite clearly initially by the fact that he comes from a military family and his parents are busy travelling during the the threat of invasion. And he is left with his aunt, Nesfield, who lives at Brancepeth in County Durham. And Brancepeth Castle at this particular moment in time, it's a huge 14th century castle, rather like Alnwick indeed, and it's in the process of massive renovation and reorganisation. And as a young man, he must have watched this, and clearly he was fascinated by it. And so he abandons the family work, as it were, military tradition of the family, and he goes into architecture. And he is a really, important and remarkable figure. He is central to changing the interesting Gothic architecture from being, let's say, an evocation of the medieval past, which is what Alnwick was in the 18th century work to Alnwick, to being a recreation of the past, but in a modern idiom.
And is that something that was happening across England or Britain as a whole, or is it something a little bit more unique to what he was doing?
I think it's a little bit, it's a bit of both, to be honest. He's following in a tradition and trajectory that is established by this great Gothic revivalist, Pugin, who has sort of blazed a trail for arguing that Gothic architecture and the medieval past are the things we ought to be trying to recreate. But like all figures, he has a slightly different take on it. He works to a certain extent on churches, which is where most Gothic revivalists work, but really his expertise and his knowledge comes to be focused on castles, and he does a huge amount of work in the north of England in particular, including, as a matter of fact, a Durham Castle much later in his career, Windsor Castle, at the Tower of London. Basically, if you have a castle in the mid to late 19th century, I think he dies in 1881 or something, but if you have a medieval castle in the mid 19th century, he is the go-to figure, and he knows a huge amount about these buildings. It's quite complicated, I think, to unpick his castle career, but one of the most important details of it, and a way in which actually he is an extraordinary figure, is in the 1840s. He is commissioned by a rich Tory peer, Conservative peer, as it were, Tory peer, to build a castle for him at Peckforton in Cheshire. And he constructs, from 1844, an entire 13th century castle on a greenfield site. Peckforton Castle still exists. It's a very, very peculiar building, and it may well have been shaped by Lord Tollemache's concern about workers' riots. There are mobs in this period, of course, this period after parliamentary reform and so forth. So, I mean, he actually uniquely creates, on an enormous scale, a completely new castle in the 13th century idiom. He had previously, curiously, also been interested and involved at Carnarvon Castle, which many of your listeners may know. He was involved in restoring parts of that building. And so he knows the North Welsh castles. I suppose you need to imagine a figure who is working on castle buildings and on medieval buildings all the time, and in the process of working on them is always building up his own understanding of their archaeology, of their technical details, and of the things that he regards as making them interesting. So that cumulative experience, I don't think probably there's anybody who's had that much cumulative experience of actually altering medieval castles, because of course he wasn't constrained as a conservation architect would be today by what he could do to these buildings. He's interested in them as medieval buildings, but he's just getting on with it basically.
It's really interesting you mentioned Carnarvon, as I remember reading your book, The English Castle, and the comparisons between what Edward I was doing in the medieval period with his North Welsh castles, and then very similar architecture happening at Alnwick in the 14th century. Was that something that carries on in subsequent stages of castle building, even into the Victorian period, that they're inspiring each other?
Yes, I think for very different reasons, but you're right, they do. I mean, in the late 13th and early 14th century, there's a small number of people who, in the king's, building works, who move from the focus of his attention in North Wales in the late 13th and early 14th century to the north of England, where people such as the Percys are building on a grand scale for the first time. They're not alone, but that border is suddenly becoming into Scotland. It's moving. These English noblemen in the late 14th century want to build castles because they want to get hold and control land in Scotland. In the 19th century, Salvin is one of these figures who is a commanding figure in the world of castle architecture and restoration. And so when things go wrong anywhere significant, he tends to be the person who's called upon. So there are different dynamics, but there is rather fascinatingly, you're quite right, a kind of echo of what has been happening in the Middle Ages, that this chap who, in both cases, there are individuals who clearly work in both places, remarkably in a way. In the 14th century, we must infer that from the architectural evidence. In the 19th century, we can know that because we have the documentary evidence.
And the Percys go through this whole period. At the time that Salvin's around, the fourth Duke of Northumberland, Algernon Percy, is starting to think about restoring his castle in the early 1850s and makes Salvin his principal architect for this. So we get into our castle specifically. What kind of things is Salvin looking at? What's he doing at Alnwick specifically?
The new Duke, the fourth Duke, when he arrives, is clearly appalled at the castle. Your listeners will remember that it's obviously largely a 14th century building, but in the 18th century, it's been massively reorganized and internally transformed. And this series of incredibly opulent, and in many ways, it's quite sad that they've so completely disappeared because they'd be fascinating to see. But these amazing early Gothic interiors, but they are very inconvenient. And the fourth Duke thinks that he deserves something much better. One of many inconveniences is that the kitchens are actually in a separate building from the hall and the dining room. And so, there are long distances to carry food. But it's not just that. There's also this inconvenience that when you get into the 14th century buildings, the way they're laid out, even as reorganized, you basically have to go through each room to get to the next room in the sequence. There's no corridor or anything that allows you to get around the building easily without going through every room. And so the Duke, despite the fact that this work has only been completed for, 50 years previously, he embarks on another enormous renovation campaign. But there is a sort of sting in the tail for Salvin. Salvin basically tries to create a series of really grand rooms. He tries to make the circulation within the building easier. But while he's doing all this and returning the castle from an 18th century evocation of the Middle Ages to what is really a much more archaeologically accurate reconstruction of what might have been there in the Middle Ages, a letter is written by the Duke saying that he wants the interior. The Duke is traveling in Italy. And he writes a letter saying he really likes Roman palazzos. And he wants, palazzi, and he wants the interior of Alnwick to be dressed up as a Roman palace. And I imagine, though Salvin is too tactful and is too dependent on his client to say so, I imagine that Salvin was absolutely horrified. But nevertheless, obviously, money speaks. And and he therefore recreated the exterior of the castle in this medieval form. But as every visitor knows, as soon as you step through the door, you're catapulted into a completely different aesthetic world. And while I'm sure Salvin disapproved, and many people even today find it slightly staggering, the opulence of that interior, the Italian interior, is extraordinary. And the way in which Salvin has managed to effect that transition is really interesting and successful. So, for example, on the outside, the windows all have these cusps. They're pointed, they're Gothic, they're medieval. But if you walk inside, he's made all the windows semicircular. So there's a transition, and you don't really notice, I think it's fair to say, that the transition from one to the other when you're inside. It's very skillfully done, and the quality of it is enormously high. It should be said, too, that other contemporaries are very open about their horror at what the Duke has done. And George Gilbert Scott, who is one of the great restorers of cathedrals and great churches in Britain in the mid-19th century, he writes at the end of his life really quite a scathing criticism of what has been done, saying that Mr. Salvin has done excellent work on the outside, but the Duke has completely misunderstood what he's trying to do internally, and he simply shouldn't have created an Italian palace. And that the tragedy is, in Scott's view, that so much money was spent on this complete absurdity. But it's interesting. I mean, Scott is also very critical of Salvin having built Peckforton. He thinks Peckforton is mad and an absurdity too. Oh. So there are different views then as now. But I think everybody would agree that the quality of the interiors is extraordinary. And handling of the different spaces within the constraints of the medieval building are very, very successful, I think, and create a really interesting sequence of rooms.
So there's this recreation of the medieval on the outside. Was it as common or as widespread to be having Roman palazzi on the inside of a castle, or is this something that's a little bit more individual to the Duke of Northumberland at the time?
There is a great fashion in the 1850s for things from Italy. And indeed, many rich British people think of themselves as the second Medici, sort of this idea that Florence of being a banking and mercantile centre of medieval Europe. And the British, of course, in the 1850s are part of the richest nation in the world, and they regard themselves also as being, mercantile. And so there's the Italian Renaissance style is enormously popular. Indeed, it is probably the most popular style of mid-19th century interior decoration anywhere. I think, nevertheless, it is pretty eccentric to do the castle on the outside and the palazzo on the inside. Though, that said, one of the revolutions of a generation earlier in the Regency, so in the first decades of the 19th century, the 1810s, 1820s, there is also, for the first time in English architecture, this idea that you can transition between styles externally and internally. So you do get buildings in this period which could be, let's say, somewhere like Seisencut in Gloucestershire. It's externally an Indian palace, but you walk inside and it's all neoclassical. Now that's a disjunction of style that nobody has really. I mean, it's a completely novel idea that you can develop a house on the outside one way and then have interior designs of a completely different kind. And so arguably what's happening in the 1850s at Alnwick is a kind of throwback to exactly that attitude. But of course, that attitude doesn't really survive. So maybe it's a throwback, maybe it's just the Duke, he starts off with a castle, he goes to Italy, he thinks, wow, this is much more interesting. If I'd started at the beginning, I would have just knocked Alnwick Castle down and built an Italian palazzo, but it's too late. I mean, I don't know, but I'm sure that there will be something, no doubt, in the papers at Alnwick that tell us more about, what influenced the Duke. But clearly just the experience of being in Italy, and we must remember that it's at a time when travel is much more complicated than it is today. He was clearly blown away by it.
And as a duke in the 19th century, why not have both?
Exactly. If you can afford it, why not? I think it's worth adding, that Salvin, of course, is certainly, he's working at a period where everybody thinks that you should be creating and using Gothic architecture to answer contemporary needs. It's the idea term development, whereby you might be building in the style of the 13th century, but you can build a railway station in that style, that you can develop ideas of the Middle Ages and make them appropriate to the contemporary world. So I think Salvin is definitely trying to create a building that operates for modern needs with all the technology of a modern building. And I mean, that's certainly clear in the scale and the complexity of the kitchen itself.
The Great Kitchen is the one interior space at Alnwick Castle that he was able to complete and execute to his designs. It is in that medieval style. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about the architecture of that main kitchen room.
It's centrally, what you call centrally planned. That is to say, it's square and the focus is on the center of the building. It rises up effectively to a louver. Kitchens in the Middle Ages and in this period are very hot places. You're working with fires that are burning all the time, and the heat that builds up needs to be dissipated. And so the way that was commonly done was to build rooms that were 2 stories tall internally, and with a louver at the top, an open vent at the top that allowed the hot air to escape. As I say, these rooms are really warm. The heat really must have built up in them. So Salvin, as it were, referring back to the style of medieval kitchens in designing the building in this way. But the space is an enormous open space. It's got a sort of what you might imagine, it's not a dome, but it's like a central dome over the top. And within this, there are fires at the sides and cooking spaces, but also we know from photographs an enormous hot plate in the center of the room. Kitchens, in great households in the Middle Ages and in the 19th century are very specialized spaces. The rich have always expected to eat extremely well. And there are large teams of specialist staff who would have worked in this space, producing food, doing different things. And the kitchen, is actually not just one room, it's actually a whole complex of rooms. One of the really interesting things that Salvin does, I think you said to me when we were there, Daniel, that the 18th century kitchens are more or less in the same place. Is that the right?
As far as we know, yes, those 18th century kitchens were there. But what Salvin does is massively expand the footprint of the building outward from what the castle walls had been. So there may be traces of those 18th century kitchens left somewhere in a loft space or vault underneath, but there's very little to suggest what they would have been like. It's like he's created an entirely new building.
Now, well, what's clever about it, of course, is that what he's done is he's built a structure, and the 18th century kitchen is the same, but his is more specialised and better designed, I imagine, is he's built into the ditch of the castle. And this means that if you imagine that the delivery of water, of coal, of fuel for cooking, and the food itself, it's a massive task getting the food to the castle when there are large numbers of people there, that he basically creates a kind of specialist service yard where everything can be delivered invisibly outside the castle walls and then taken into this system, food taken to storage areas, fuel to its own storage spaces, and then everything moved around within it so that the food is produced within the kitchen and then taken to the table. So it's a very complex arrangement which accommodates the delivery of food, the delivery of fuel, the reception of water, which of course is crucial for cooking, all within this structure that's effectively in the moat and therefore sunk down slightly within the structure of the castle and hidden from all the polite rooms and the polite interiors of the building. So it's very cleverly plugged on to the outside of the medieval castle. And one of the interests, I suppose, of going around it is that you see how all these different spaces do interact, that there are cool rooms, that there are rooms for washing, that there are rooms, all these different things, there are specialist rooms for everything. That itself is a phenomenon of 19th century great house planning, that these enormous households. It's a time when labour is cheap and there are enormously specialists. Well, every task acquires a specialist staff. Don't forget that we have so many machines now that do convenient things for us. This is a kitchen in which everything has to be made by hand, and so you do have these different departments of the kitchen. They're all working as specialists, and the analogy which is drawn between these buildings and the present day is with great hotel kitchens, where there are lots of specialist groups of staff producing, you have an egg counter and a fish counter and a meat and all these different things, everybody doing their own thing to produce meals. And in terms of man-hours, massively, massive commitment. And food is, throughout this period, is one of the great costs of a great house. And I suppose the point has been made by the food historian Peter Breers that, at this time, again, the British nobility are not just rich, they're the richest people in the world, and they expect to eat incredibly well. And some of the menu cards you have do make that point, that people are eating meals with, enormous numbers of courses coming one after the other. And, then as now, you can imagine the impatience if things don't come to the table quickly. People just expect it all to happen.
And thanks to the work that he did in the Great Kitchen, that is all able to be prepared. The biggest joints of meat are played in to dinners by the Northumbrian piper to the Duke. So there's a ceremony to it as well, which helps link those functional spaces like the kitchen, which we love that people can now see those spaces when they visit, to what you described as the polite rooms and the rooms that guests would see. But Salvin had an impact on those as well, even to the point of the guests arriving at the castle, because as of the mid-19th century, they enter the staterooms via a porte cochere, and they go up a grand staircase that is now on the interior, which it had never been in the castle up to that point.
Basically, if you're arriving in a carriage or, from the early 20th century in a car, you don't want to get yourself wet walking between your carriage and the house. And in the early 19th century, for the first time, people begin to create these, what are really carriage porches, where, but Alnwick presents very particular problems for a carriage. I mean, if you imagine you have 2 or 4 horses drawing a carriage, it's more like an articulated lorry in length than a modern car. Alnwick, of course, has this central courtyard, and what Salvin does is he effectively creates a turning circle so that you drive through the gate, and that in that courtyard there is a circle around which you can drive a carriage. and that the carriage in that circle incorporates in front of the front door a porch that comes over the carriageway so that you can step out without getting wet. In exposed places, I've actually recently seen in Sligo on the west coast of Scotland, there's a house right on the coast that has a porte cochere with great gates to it, because the wind howling off the Atlantic is clearly so strong that when you came in your carriage, you actually needed to close the door before you could get out, and it becomes a kind of external porch to the house itself. How that quite worked with the horses, I don't know, but it's a very big structure, and it's a reminder that people cared then as now about the weather. There's no want to arrive absolutely soaking wet when you come for dinner. You have the elegance of arriving in your carriage and stepping out. It's also, I suppose, worth saying too that the analogy that's been drawn of cost between running, well, the analogy of cost of running a carriage and a coach and horses is not of a modern family running a motor car, which is relatively cheap. It's more of a family running a helicopter. The cost that you're paying, both for the thing itself, for the horses, for the keep of the horses, for the grooms, for the postilions, all these different things, the costs are enormous. So relatively speaking, if you have a carriage, you are very, very wealthy indeed. And you expect, if you're arriving for an elegant dinner, a porte cochere is a sort of essential addition. The wonder is people didn't think of it earlier.
So people can see that because that is still the entrance into the staterooms today. The great kitchen is now open and people can see Salvin's work there as well. But on the outside, probably the main, most obvious evidence for what he did in the 1850s is the Prudhoe Tower, which houses on its inside the library. It's the tallest tower of Alnwick Castle today, as far as we can tell. And that is a Salvin creation between 1854 and probably 57. Do these 19th century towers, if you were looking at the castle today, can you tell that's not medieval?
When you know about these things, you can. But I mean, I do think it's a very convincing addition. Yeah. And Salvin, adds lots of additional. He adds the chapel tower, doesn't he, as well? And again, I think most people who visit simply wouldn't recognise the dates of these things. I suppose there is this thing which you could call the Harry Potter test, which is that when you think of what was filmed in the films, they move seamlessly between the 19th and the medieval elements of the castle without anybody batting an eyelid. It all looks completely coherent. The one thing I would add also, I think, about the reorganization of the building. There are three great northern castles, all of which are massively reorganized in this period. One is Brandsputh, that Salvin watches being done a generation earlier, but Raby and Alnwick. And what I think at Alnwick is really interesting that Salvin inherits and deals with in such an interesting way is the complexity of the existing plan. I think that the way you walk through the rooms at Alnwick and the shape of those rooms, they actually work really, really, really well. They're much more interesting than rectangular rooms, which is what you would have built, let's say, in a Roman palazzo, or indeed if you were building in London on a greenfield site. There's a kind of interest and a dynamism to the way you walk through Alnwick, which Salvin has created by working within the constraints of this very complex medieval building. He's not afraid of adding to it, but he basically respects, like a sort of piece of grit in the pearl, he respects what's there already sufficiently that it shapes his architecture and he doesn't overwhelm it with his own. The one other interior, it should also be said, other than the kitchen where you can kind of see what he would have done had he been given probably a free hand, is the chapel, where again it's a spectacular Gothic interior, very, very opulent, as befits a chapel. A very important interior within the house, and very much more architectural. It doesn't have fabrics so much in it, furnishing it to the same degree as the other domestic rooms. And I think the chapel and the kitchen, they're both in their way. The kitchen, obviously, much more austere, but they're both spectacular spaces. They do show what Salvin might have done otherwise. One thing, I don't want to advertise lots of other castles, but of course, Bamborough is when the changes, again, another generation later in the 1890s. I can't remember when Lord Armstrong buys Bamborough, but it may even be in 1901 or something. I can't quite remember. But, he there creates all these rooms which are much more in a medieval idiom. They're not really accurately medieval, but again, they give a flavour of probably what Salvin might have done in his own idiom, if he'd been given a free hand a generation earlier.
I was actually going to ask, as almost a final thing, where else other than Alnwick people might see Salvin at work and can kind of see the contribution he made to the history of architecture.
Well, one of the most remarkable places to see, and a relatively early building for him, I think he gets involved in 1838, is Harlexton Manor in Lincolnshire. And this is built for a bachelor collector. It's a building of absolutely stupendous scale, which incorporates all these Elizabethan and Jacobean and late medieval details. That is one of the most extraordinary architectural fantasies you will see anywhere. It's now an American educational college, and they look after it really, really beautifully. But I think if you look at castles, you basically can't avoid coming across Salvin in some form. I mean, whether it's from Carnarvon to the Tower of London to Windsor, he's there all the way through. So you can see little bits of his work in all kinds of places. But I suppose, the buildings that do shed light on his work at Alnwick, I mean, I think we have mentioned them. I mean, Raby is one. I don't think he's actually involved at Raby, but it is a building which, again, it's of the same generation of 14th century buildings, slightly later than the foundation of Alnwick, but it's another of these really major buildings by the Neville family, who, of course, are the great rivals to the Percys in the north of England.
Yes.
And it is developed in the late 18th and early 19th century on a spectacular scale by the Vane family. I mean, it's an amazing building. And when you walk through its principal saloons and things, they're very, very similar. I think they're by William Byrne. And interestingly, at Harlexton, Salvin is actually supplanted by William Byrne, this great Scottish architect who does lots of buildings, great country houses. So there's an interesting connection there. But I mean, I think the Lord Armstrong's redevelopment of Bamborough is another really fascinating parallel to what happens at Alnwick. It's somebody else using history in a completely different context again, trying to sort of celebrate history and link themselves to it. And again, it's a really fascinating reworking of one of the most ancient fortified sites in the British Isles. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary to see what's done there. And then finally, there is Peckforton, this castle. I mean, again, it's really a wedding venue now, and it's not easy of access, but you can't miss it. If you get on the train or drive to Chester, you come near Chester and you will see Beeston, this great 13th century castle set on a hill, and immediately opposite there is Peckforton, this other great 19th century castle set on a hill, and consciously, the two consciously echo one another, and they are extraordinary. And both of them, Beeston is wonderful to climb up to. It's not much of a castle. It does have, the walls and the gatehouse and everything. It's rather wonderful, but Peckforton is extraordinary, and a complete 19th century house built in the style of a 13th century castle. Very remarkable indeed. But I would recommend Alnwick to all. I think even Scott admitted in his criticism that it's stupendous. You may not like it, but it's absolutely amazing. He does create the romantic outline of the castle that is so wonderful from the exterior. And I think that has a lot to do, technical, but to do with his connections with Nash and the architect John Nash and the romantic movement. And but it's... externally, it's brilliantly successful, and internally, it's extraordinarily rich. And I mean, when I was there most recently, again, I was sort of taken aback afresh by the sheer quality. I mean, the ceilings in particular. I mean, they are just astounding. These carved coffered ceilings, and all the rooms with these massive fireplaces that make you feel dwarfed by the scale of the room. It's a really interesting way of designing rooms, creating fireplaces that are so big that the one bit of a room you can get close to architecturally, they're so big they make you feel small. It's a trick used by figures such as Hawksmoor and in late 17th and early 18th century, and Salvin is doing it again. It's amazing, really.
So we hope that when people next come to visit, as a result of listening to you give some more insights into Salvin and the work he did in the kitchens and around the castle, there'll be a different way of looking even at the building itself. So thank you very much for explaining his role here at Alnwick and across the country in the 19th century. And thank you for being with us again on the podcast.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. It's really kind.
It was fascinating to speak to John Goodall about this period in the history of Alnwick Castle. To hear John talk about his book, The Castle, A History, please head into our podcast back catalogue and look for episode 6, The Castle, A History. You can also listen to John speak in our Constable's Tower exhibition if you visit us here at the castle. And of course, if you are visiting, you'll also be able to see the results of Anthony Salvin's work for the 4th Duke, from the Prudhoe Tower to the Great Kitchen. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast. We'll be back next month with our final episode of 2025. Until then, I've been Daniel. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.